When you read code that other people wrote, do you ever wonder how it's organized? Ever wonder what they're thinking? This is Bruce, and together we are Grokin. The Elixir programming language is a functional language, and that means it's usually written in layers. In functional languages, we usually have something called the functional core or the pure layer. And we have an API layer, or also called the imperative shell or the boundary layer. And in Phoenix applications, the core layer is the schema and the boundary layer is the context. But sometimes I think about these layers in terms of certainty. In the boundary layer, things can possibly fail. And that means that we should look for things like tagged tuples to capture error conditions, or exceptions, or exclamation points, or wrapping layers. Let me show you what I mean. So what I have here is a generated Phoenix application. The application is called Boundary. And inside it, there are two major divisions, one for the API layer and one for the web layer. Now I want to focus this piece on the boundary layer. So inside the boundary, we have these top level modules. We have a repo, a mailer, an application, and accounts. And then inside the accounts, we would typically have what is called a core layer. So the way to read this is that we have this layer called accounts, accounts.ex. And if I crack this open, one of the things that you'll see is CRUD functions, create, read, update, delete. But these APIs can conceivably fail. And when we look at them, we can read them through that lens. Here's what I mean. So this is my API layer, and let's make a little bit more room here. And as I scan down, these are things that can possibly fail. And we're going to see the failure encapsulated in a couple of ways. One, we could consume other boundary layers that fail. Like in this case, the database is represented by the repo. And second, I can have conditional logic. This logic looks up the user. If it exists, it does one thing. Otherwise, it does something else. In this case, it returns a nil. And another clue is in the API, I could have an exclamation point and in the libraries that we consume inside. In this case, you can see that this API and the underlying repo both specify an exclamation point, and that means that it can raise an exception. So this is something that can fail, and we're dealing with that failure through execution. And the last thing that I want to point out is that sometimes we can have a wrapping construct. And that wrapping construct in Elixir is usually a tag tuple, so it could be a tuple with an OK or an error as the first element, or it could be a struct like a change set. And in this case, I have change user registration, where I start with a user, and then I have some poison in the system. This is user input that hasn't been validated yet. And so here, I'm returning the change set, which might or might not be valid. So this is an opportunity for me to wrap this in the boundary and then consume this in some type of API that can deal with failure. In this case, my repo layer or the database layer knows how to check to see if something is valid before it's added to the database. Another option is that I might deal with tag tuples. In this case, this tuple represents success and this tuple represents failure. But by scanning for these techniques, I can see composition that's a little bit more complicated than I will see elsewhere in the Elixir programming language, because it represents things that might be able to fail. And if I crack open accounts, specifically the user, I don't see any of those other things here. I see these beautiful pipelines because, well, once I start working with the user and once I cast, this is going to return a working change set all the way through this pipeline and all the way through this pipeline. So if I'm in a core layer, one of the things that I'll often see is a composition with simpler concepts like the Elixir pipe. And in fact, Elixir is organized so that the first element in most functions is the accumulator or the core data type for that function. And so in this way, I can tell the difference between a boundary layer and a core layer. It's not a perfect technique, but it's a good way to understand the intentions of the user whose code that you're consuming. And so with one quick visual inspection, I can see how is this particular programmer dealing with errors? And second, what are the composition techniques? Do they have to allow for failure or not? And by looking at just these two things, I have a great look into the mind of the developer, and I could tell whether they're thinking core or boundary. This is Bruce, and together we're Grokin.